Okay, so welcome. My name is Lauren Wang. I am at the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency, managing climate adaptation and land use initiatives. Welcome to the post-disaster buyout panel. We have today here 4 local experts in buyout who are going to sort of take a different approach from the ground up compared to the presentation that we just saw this morning. Before joining the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, I managed New York City's post-Sandy buyout acquisition and tenant relocation programs alongside one of our panelists at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. So I'm going to give a little bit of context before we get into the presentations. Nearly 7 years ago, Hurricane Sandy hit the region with unprecedented force. Sandy highlighted the region's vulnerability and underscores the urgency of meeting the challenge of climate change. It also granted the region and its local government entities the resources to advance planning and action on climate risks. We are continuing to close out the Sandy recovery process along with recovery from other storm and rain events, most notably Irene and Lee in 2011. Meanwhile, our partners at the New York City Panel on Climate Change, who localize climate projections for the city, have continued their work forecasting future climate hazards. With all this, it is clear that post-disaster buyouts and buyouts in general will be an important tool in recovery and adaptation. So, I'm joined by distinguished panelists today who have deep experience in ongoing land acquisition and buyout programs in the New York, New Jersey region. Before I introduce them, I'd like to share a few other things. First of all, flooding is the region's greatest climate risk, but here it takes many forms. We're sitting right now within a complex natural system of rivers, bays, and estuaries. Our floods come from the coast, our waterways, the sewer pipes beneath us, and the sky. All of this is projected to get worse over time, and the magnitude of that risk is both vast and great. Secondly, this is the most densely and largest most densely populated and largest metropolitan region in the country. 1 out of 15 Americans lives in this area, which stretches across New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. We have neighborhoods in urban, suburban, and rural contexts. We have local, state, and regional levels of government, and millions of homes in an extremely tight and competitive housing market. Because of this, there are opportunities for cross-pollination, learning, and exchange between the several buyout programs that we have in the area. Third, as flooding increases, home values will eventually drop, but we don't actually know how these dynamics will play out in our particular housing market. Post-Sandy, some neighborhoods saw home values rebound very quickly, while others didn't. So, in terms of buyout, who needs help, and who gets left behind? And so within this context, I'd like to introduce our panelists in the order of their presentations. Jane Brogan is the Chief Policy and Research Officer for the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, which works on post-Sandy, Lee, and Irene disaster recovery programs across 38 counties in New York State. Jane will speak to buyouts as one tool among many in the disaster recovery toolkit. Deborah Morris is the Executive Director of Resiliency Planning, Policy, and Acquisitions at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, the largest agency of its kind in the nation. Deborah leads the city's post-Sandy buyout program and advises the agency on the intersection of disaster recovery, resiliency, and affordable housing. Deborah will speak to how equity and resettlement play out in the unique context of New York City's housing market. Dave Tobias is the Section Chief of Land Acquisition Programs at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, which acquires property in the riverine communities of the New York City watershed, a couple counties north of here. Dave has led this program since 1996 and really has shaped its evolution from post-disaster to a long-term community-led process. Lastly, Fawn McGee is Director of Blue Acres and Bureau Chief of the Green Acres State Land Acquisition Program at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Fawn manages 2 distinct but connected programs that work with property owners to create and preserve open space across the state. Fawn has the unique seat of administering both a post-Sandy program and a long-standing open space conservation program. So the panel today will start with a series of short talks from each of the panelists, followed by a discussion and Q&A. I want to leave a healthy amount of time for the Q&A, and so we'll do our best to try to do a third, and a third for each. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to Jane. Sorry, let me help you get this up.
Great. Thank you for having me here today. It's truly an honor to join everyone on this panel and everyone at this conference to participate in this valuable conference, which underscores the effects of climate change and the importance of resiliency, not just as abstract concepts, but as visible and tangible issues taking place in our own communities. We can no longer escape the reality in which we live, one characterized by the threats of climate change, rising sea levels, and frequently occurring extreme weather events. Coming on the heels of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee in 2011, on October 29, 2012, Superstorm Sandy caused unprecedented damage to New York, forever changing the way in which we think about, plan for, and respond to extreme weather events. It was a reminder that in many situations, in order to become more resilient, we must begin to choose techniques that work with nature. At the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, or GOSR, we strive to put this theory into practice. GOSR was created in June 2013 to coordinate New York State's recovery efforts and to administer the state's $4.6 billion allocation of Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funding that we received from HUD. With 5 core programs, housing, small business, infrastructure, community reconstruction, and rebuild by design, GOSR sought to strike a balance between urgent action and long-term strategic planning by quickly delivering aid to those with immediate rebuilding needs while also developing resiliency solutions for long-term protection. While Sandy received the lion's share of media coverage, the 2 previous storms in 2011, Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, resulted in widespread damage and disruption all over the Hudson Valley, southern tier, and central and northern parts of New York. All told, 38 counties were declared as presidential disaster areas as a result of the 3 storms. These counties are home to more than 15 million people. GOSR's programs are implemented mostly outside of New York City, as New York City received their own CDBG-DR grant, with the exception of our community reconstruction and buyout programs. In the weeks and months following Superstorm Sandy, housing became one of our most urgent and pressing needs. Yet we quickly recognized that we could not pursue a one-size-fits-all approach to recovery. Standing in contrast to housing repair and reconstruction offerings, our buyout program acknowledges the fact that rebuilding is not always the wisest or more practical solution for every circumstance, and that some neighborhoods are simply no longer safe for residential occupancy. I would also like to note that the buyout program works hand in hand with our acquisition program, which purchases storm-damaged properties and then auctions them off for more resilient development. This program operates in areas with slightly less risk of future flooding and complements the buyout program. The acquisition program is integral in retaining housing stock in communities where often we're taking hundreds of homes off the tax rolls and ensures a well-rounded approach to municipal resiliency. Again, it's not about one strategy being better than the other, but rather knowing when and where to use each. When employed appropriately, the programs together make homeowners and the communities more resilient. The buyout program, which operates in 3 select neighborhoods of Staten Island, as well as sections of Long Island and 1 riverine community in upstate New York, is a voluntary program and aims to address areas where property and residents were regularly at risk. The program purchases storm-damaged properties of interested homeowners at pre-storm fair market value plus incentives. The structures are then demolished and the land is graded and reseeded with native plant species. A restrictive covenant is recorded to prohibit any future development, with the ultimate result being that the land is permanently maintained as open space and acts as a natural coastal buffer, which can help protect entire neighborhoods and communities. To date, we have collectively purchased 1,277 homes, totaling over $480 million through both the buyout and acquisition programs. Through the buyout program alone, we've purchased over 700 properties for more than $270 million and completed over 90% of all expected demolitions. Perhaps one of our most successful buyout areas is the Oakwood Beach neighborhood of Staten Island, where we've purchased 300 properties, which is about 25.5 acres of land. The pictures on this slide show this area in 2012 pre-Sandy, in 2014 with some demolitions completed, and today is green space. Since Gozer is temporary, having to spend our federal grant by September 2022, we are not a suitable long-term land steward for our buyout areas. Recognizing this fact, we have been in discussions with state and city agencies, nonprofits, and other organizations to think about the long-term future of these parcels. Examples of some of the end use of our buyout areas, including building green infrastructure such as rainwater catchment systems and bioswales, expansions of municipal parks, and increased access to the water for the public, as well as providing properties to neighbors through a Lot Next Door program, which is a good strategy for our scattered buyout sites. While we admittedly don't have all the answers, we recognize that our experiences and knowledge may be useful to others who face disasters after us or are proactively thinking about resiliency efforts. For this reason, we are documenting our efforts in hope of continuing to share best practices and memorializing what has worked and what hasn't. There are several lessons learned and challenges to keep in mind for a buyout program that we discovered. The main two is incentivizing participation and figuring out the disposition strategy. And I think both talk to the fact that early and frequent discussions with the community will help. Homeowners are attached to their homes and most likely could face hardship finding comparable housing within their purchasing power. Programs should aim to convey the array of benefits of a buyout, as well as think about what financial incentives can be provided. Though that gets to one of the challenges of a buyout program, which is that it's expensive. Buyout programs are most successful with maximum buy-in, and that can be costly. There are other costs as well, such as long-term O&M, demolition, insurance, taxes and fees, and compliance monitoring. And then just in an effort of time, I will go through some of these others just quickly. The determining and finding partners for effective disposition strategies talks to early stakeholder engagement, both for the community members, small business, local officials, and homeowners. When you talk to people about a buyout program, you will most likely get maximum buy-in from homeowners, and you will be able to find end use that will be compatible to what the community needs. And as these programs are expensive, and a lot of it is through federal funding, there's a lot of federal requirements that come along with that funding, including how to deal with rental properties and federal relocation requirements for renters and other compliance with federal regulations. While it's important to understand the challenges, they shouldn't discourage anyone from developing a buyout program. Early and frequent stakeholder discussion is a key lesson learned from both our program for homeowner participation and working with organizations on the disposition. Managed retreat is a strategy that effectively eliminates risk by restoring land to its natural floodplain functions and has the potential to create synergies with other resilience and adaptation strategies. I can speak for everyone at Gozer when I say we are enormously proud of what we have accomplished, dedicated to the work still ahead, and incredibly grateful for those who have helped us in realizing a better and stronger New York. Thank you again for having me here today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Deborah Morris. I'm the Executive Director of Resiliency Planning at New York City Housing Preservation and Development, and it's so exciting to be here among so many different practitioners, policymakers, thinkers, and researchers around the issues of climate adaptation and land use policy. As Jane has already described, our region and the city of New York were already very aggressively looking at the issues of climate change adaptation and climate risk, but Hurricane Sandy in 2012 was a real wake-up call to the way flood risk in particular and storm surge can affect our high-density communities. New York City is, beyond being the most populous region in in the country, has a state of housing crisis, and over 100,000 households are homeless each year. 60,000 school-age students are homeless each year. So the issue of housing affordability, housing access, and where people live is a considerable issue without looking at flood risk. So when Superstorm Sandy affected the city and took thousands of people out of their households for days, weeks, months, years, it was a reason to think about where we live, how we live, and how the city has to adjust around risk. As part of Hurricane Sandy's recovery, the city had its own buyout and acquisition programs, which worked in concert with the state's buyout and acquisition programs, as well as a federal U.S. Department of Agriculture program. The city's programs around property purchase were focused and rolled into our housing recovery programs, which offered choice. Owners were able, as part of this enrollment, to receive, excuse me, let me look at my notes. Were able to have choices around whether they wanted to have their home repaired, rebuilt, or purchased by the program. And as the period of hurricane recovery in 2012 and 2013, programs evolved based on homeowner demands. So the city's program around housing repair and recovery was originally focused on property purchases that could be redeveloped. With time, we saw that a number of the properties which owners were interested in selling were not appropriate for housing redevelopment. So the city launched its own buyout program, and its buyout program is differentiated from the state's buyout program because it was not geographically defined. We looked at property considerations and made choices based on each property on whether it had land use considerations that allowed for redevelopment or if it was inappropriate to be reused as housing. So looking at each home, determining whether or not it's appropriate for redevelopment and whether an owner is eligible, you look at the cost to repair, and a substantially damaged home could qualify for rebuild or an elevation or acquisition or buyout. The vast majority of participants in the city's housing recovery program selected to have their home repaired. And one of the reasons we think this is the case is because there are very few housing opportunities in the region, and the availability of a purchase price doesn't make it the reasonable next step to rehouse. That said, we had 126 participants in our program, splitting pretty 50-50 on houses that could be redeveloped or bought out. And buyouts must be open space in perpetuity from our federal partners, from the Community Development Block Grant for disaster recovery, and acquisition for redevelopment properties should be redeveloped as a new resilient home. So looking at the redevelopment of housing, we look at zoning, land use, the access to infrastructure, the presence of wetlands and coastal erosion, the effects of the flood zone and future flood zone, regulatory constraints, and planned public assets, capital projects, regulatory changes, and community planning. And community planning was actually a significant part of the city's program, working with our partners at the Department of City Planning and reaching out to the diverse communities within New York City to understand how they view flood risk and how they feel their communities should change, and trying to pair these recovery programs with not just the present conditions but the future. So looking at what differentiates an acquisition property from a buyout property, an acquisition property is generally surrounded by other homes in relatively good condition, or are in places where one could imagine a future with redevelopment, even if it's a different type of redevelopment than the current present pattern. A typical buyout property is on the waterfront or in a wetland, and is showing the conditions of evolution back into a natural state. Our inventory is concentrated along the city's southern coast, the South Shore of Staten Island, southern Brooklyn, the Rockaways, and Jamaica Bay. And I want to spend a moment really talking about the challenge in buyout and acquisition programs in finding property management and appropriate users. The City of New York operates its acquisition and buyout programs through a third party called Project Rebuild. That's because the city can't directly acquire property without a public approval process. A public approval process is not an efficient way to help disaster victims, and it also intersects with the challenge of who's making decisions about change, and how do you comprehensively plan for these challenges. If you're someone in a disaster setting, that's not a conversation you want to be part of. You want to be able to dispose of your property efficiently. So the portfolio is managed by this third party, and the city works with that third party to find new owners of those properties. We have quite a bit of property that's planned to come into public ownership, and that public ownership will bring both great opportunities to cultivate and expand existing wetlands and open spaces and parks and recreation opportunities, but also challenges with unprogrammed, unimproved property that takes significant amount of fund to make publicly accessible, safe, or productive, as well as maintained into the future. For our housing sites, the simple answer is to just sell properties to the highest bidder, but I can talk about affordable housing in another moment. Some challenges of our program and highlights are that it's a voluntary program, so people are interested in being engaged. We offer pre-storm value minus assistance and debts, and construction options are also offered. There are many barriers to sale, which is why we think participation was particularly low. Owners, particularly moderate and low-income owners, require the satisfaction of mortgages, payoffs, liens, resolutions of bankruptcy, and counseling through foreclosure. And approximately 1/3 of eligible sellers chose not to proceed because they were unable to resolve their title issues or were unable to rehouse with the proceeds of their sale after the settlement of their debts. Related to relocation, as I mentioned, New York City is in housing crisis, and even sellers with significant proceeds were unable to rehouse in quality housing. The city offered an incentive program to increase options for owners of $150,000 in down payment assistance. This had very poor participation given the opportunity, we believe, because the owners were unable to find housing even with such a significant benefit. Relocation of tenants is very challenging given New York City's housing choice. And last but not least, New York City is in the process of developing a plan to affirmatively further fair housing. This plan is called Where We Live, and it's a collaborative process through working with New Yorkers to understand how challenges like segregation affect where people live. What we found to date is that New Yorkers feel they have very few housing choice and opportunities and little meaningful options. So in the development of buyout programs, we can't just look at what land should be, but also where can people go and create options and opportunity elsewhere in our city. Thank you.
I'm Dave Tobias with New York City's Department of Environmental Protection. And as Lauren mentioned earlier, you heard about the big picture issues this morning. Here you're hearing about the frontline implementation of some of these big ideas and some of the challenges that go with those. So I come at this a bit sideways. If you come away with nothing else from my talk other than this, please remember that New York City is a city of about 8 or 9 million people, about half the population of New York State, but it gets its water supply from a much larger area upstate, about 2,000 square miles. And this is the focus of my program and a number of other watershed protection programs to protect this very large water supply, which is, for the most part, again, 2,000 square miles, owned in private hands. And so I came to this work with the goal of protecting New York City's water supply for the next 1,000 years, to make sure that the most sensitive lands are protected. And we can continue delivering approximately 1 billion gallons of water every day to the city, and hopefully you all have enjoyed that today wherever you come from. Best water in the world. To implement a broad series of watershed protection programs, one of the linchpins was the land acquisition program, about $700 million at this point, focused on protecting large blocks of land. And to date, we've acquired about 100,000 acres in fee simple and another 50,000 odd acres in conservation easements. We have a number of other ancillary land acquisition programs. Of course, what I want to do today is talk to you briefly about the flood buyout efforts. And there are really two categories: FEMA flood buyout partnerships and New York City funded flood buyout effort. All of the lands that we purchase, whether under the flood buyout efforts or others, follow pretty straightforward rules. Willing seller, willing buyer. We can't force anyone to sell. We appraise everything at fair market value, although there are some nuances there with the flood buyout program. Conservation easements must be conveyed to New York State on everything we purchase in fee simple, and we pay property taxes on everything that comes into New York City's ownership. So here's what the watershed looks like today. The dark green blotches you see here are roughly that 150,000 acres that we've acquired since 1997. And those are the average size property that we are buying is about 85 acres, but we've acquired properties up to 1,000 acres and more. If you zoom into some of these hamlets, though, this block is about 350 acres in size. You can see little tiny parcels about a quarter, half acre in size, and these are flood buyout acquisitions that we've pursued in the center of local communities. And of course, these communities, like New York City, we build them in attractive places. These are generally in the valleys on top of the streams, at the junctions of rivers, right, where farms can get access to water, where there were transportation routes. Back in, there have been two storms of note in 1996, and then, of course, in 2011, Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee. You can see them. You can see this is Irene based right over New York State, and you can see the watershed here. So the first programs that we initiated were really brought to us as a request from local communities who wanted New York City to participate in a FEMA funded partnership after designated storms. And so we engaged as a partner, putting up about 25%, acquiring 30 or 40 properties back in the late 1990s, and then again after Tropical Storm Lee and Irene, we engaged in another series of FEMA partnerships. Again, those were community-driven, brought to us by the communities, and in part because we are extremely sensitive about the notion of buying residential dwellings, right? New York City acquired properties, in large part taking properties to build those reservoirs 100 years ago, and we have a lot of baggage. So we never want to be seen as pushing, depopulating the watershed. There are a lot of politics involved. And so we basically agreed to allow communities to drive this process of bringing us to the table to participate as a partner in flood buyout programs. So the communities then came to us after Irene and asked us to not just wait in reactive position for FEMA to designate storms, but to create a proactive program where the city would fund an effort to acquire properties that were either just not eligible, just ineligible for FEMA, or for whatever reason considered as important to forestall future flooding problems. So we've allocated $15 million or more to this process. It doesn't seem like a lot, but of course this is upstate. Property values are not what they are in New York City, and that actually goes quite a far way. So there are five different categories of properties that you're allowed to step into in terms of eligibility. First is inundation. Second is erosion. Third is critical infrastructure, such as, a police station, a fire department, et cetera. Stream projects, usually involving a number of properties that need to come together in order to stabilize a reach of stream. And then finally, local flood assessment, which I will spend a moment on talking about, because these are generally very focused. These are high focus for communities to bring to us. And what happens is you may picture, say, a bridge that was washed out, or abutments, or an area that was filled and is causing additional flooding problems. So communities are looking at where they can effectuate the biggest delta for changing that next flood elevation, for lowering that flood elevation next time. And so they'll consider any number of different projects, and one or two will come out of that filter, and the municipality will approve that project and effectively propose it to us, again with city funding. If they reach out and we get a willing landowner, then the local municipality needs to pass a resolution. We hope that they will agree to own it, so the city will step up and effectuate the transaction, but we hope the local community will take ownership of that land, and we'll engage in the transaction and bring it to the closing, and hopefully the town will step up and acquire that property. And then again, as we don't want to be seen to be demolishing houses, New York City, we have a local non-governmental organization taking care of that side of it. This is just a quick example of what it might look like. This is the village of Walton, looked at 4 different local flood assessment projects, and they chose the 2 on top, the Water Street and the non-anchor business. So those are the 2 projects that the village of Walton pursued, and each of them requiring several different landowners and land acquisition projects. So as an overview, total of so far to date 77 projects, about 120 acres, and about just under $3 million so far, and we're just at the beginning of that city-funded program. So just in terms of the challenges to wrap up here, for us, the properties are small and isolated. That's why we want local ownership. We don't want the city to have to manage and monitor over decades and centuries quarter-acre lots in the middle of villages. Conservation easements that we have to convey to the state regardless of who owns these properties are complex tools for tiny little properties. Land encroachments, neighbors in these small areas, in these small neighborhoods are problematic. Politics, of course, because you get town supervisors and town boards who do change every 2 years. So, for example, we just had one town last week vote not to engage anymore in these buyout programs, which surprised us. Municipalities don't always want to say no. Don't want to own the properties, and it's hard for us to say no when they bring these properties to us. That's it for me. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Hey, Kate. All right, let's see how I can set this up. All right. So my name's Fawn McGee. Thanks for inviting the New Jersey contingent to the New York party we're having today. I'm the director of the New Jersey Blue Acres Buyout Program, which is part of our Department of Environmental Protection. Our program is similar to David's in that we've been around prior to Sandy. Initially, we started making acquisitions. Oh, my bad. Here?
I think this one.
Okay. Gotcha. Okay. So initially, we started making buyouts with state dollars at 100% funding. And in 2010, we switched over and started expanding our funding sources to include competitive grants and federal disaster dollars. I'm happy to report that actually today, as we speak, the New Jersey Assembly is voting to provide us with a stable source of funding through corporate business tax. So that's going to actually allow us to do buyouts well into the future. And that's a good thing because, as the slides indicate, we suffer a lot of flooding in New Jersey. In fact, there have been over 1,000 flood events in the state just over the last 30 years. According to FEMA, flooding is New Jersey's #1 natural hazard. 35% of the state and many of our population centers are located within a special flood hazard area. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Northeast has seen a greater increase in extreme precipitation, which is more than any other region in the country. And by 2045, New Jersey will be especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. New Jersey will be second only to Florida in the number of homes at risk for flooding, nearly 62,000 residential properties. New Jersey had more precipitation in 2018 than any other year since we started recording it in 1895. 10 out of 12 months of the year, precipitation was above average. So it wasn't just one big storm or two big events, it was just constant rain. New Jersey is the most densely populated state in the Union, with very little land that's unpaved. This is especially true along our New Jersey shore communities. People have to move their cars to higher ground whenever there are heavy rains predicted, and sometimes even when there's a full moon. Our inland riverine communities are experiencing nuisance or that sunny day flooding on more frequent basis because this is our new norm. Now, this is a June 8th New York Times photo of a homeowner in Illinois, but this could be anywhere. The reality is if I were presenting this information tomorrow, I could have taken pictures of South Jersey of what's happening right now because they're doing evacuations by boat. Our turnpikes, our major roadways are actually closed down because of flooding that's happening right now as we speak. Thankfully, it was south of me, 20, 30 minutes south of me, but I was able to actually still get here today. So in New Jersey, we experience, again, like I said, a lot of flooding, and what we do is we basically have three options that we give folks. They can rebuild, they can elevate, or they can sell their property in the open space. As we all know, the National Flood Insurance Program or private insurance companies, they help finance, restore, and rebuild properties after flooding, but we all know the NFIP is in trouble. From that same New York Times article, it reported that only about a third of homes in the floodplain across the country actually have flood insurance. And of those, a quarter are low income. As premiums are rising between 5 to 9% a year, some as high as 18%. So if you're on a fixed income, you face some challenging choices. And we are encountering homeowners who have already let their flood insurance lapse because they can't afford it anymore. Or the other side of they don't want to put a claim in because they're afraid their flood insurance is going to increase and then they're not going to be able to afford it. So not everyone can or should elevate. And as a buyout conservation-minded person who's been in the field for 24 years, my opinion is that elevation saved the structures but not the families. In New Jersey, a 15-foot elevation starts at about $150,000. Homeowners have to pay up front, and then they have to wait to be reimbursed, and not always at 100%. Some communities that we're working with have actually started to change ordinances to require that properties be elevated before they can be resold because of the cost, the emergency service costs that's harming them. And what happens to older residents that have to climb the steps of those homes? And you look at these homes that are 15, 20 feet high, unless they come with elevators or dumbwaiters, as the demographics of those homeowners that own a home for 30 years get older, it gets more challenging for them. Since 1995, we have been chipping away at the cycle of paying families to continue to live in disaster-prone or flooded homes. Buyouts are not only save families, but they actually increase the amount of precious permeable soil where floodwaters can be reabsorbed. Buyouts can be complicated and complex, but over time, not only do they permanently remove families from harm's way, but they reduce the constant, repetitive state, local, and federal costs associated with those vulnerable properties. In 2013, the Blue Acres program was tasked with purchasing and demolishing up to 1,300 properties that were Sandy affected or had been repetitively flooded. To date, we've made 965 offers, we've purchased 690 homes, and we've demolished over 625 homes in the last 6 years. FEMA considers us a national model as well as HUD. A lot of our funding from Sandy came from both HUD and FEMA. And now here we are, almost 7 years after Sandy. We're focused on the future and how we can improve disaster prevention as opposed to reaction for families in New Jersey. With increased precipitation, temperature, and sea level rise, and the extreme weather events that they produce, we expect to be busy. I want to take 1 minute, if I may. One of my staff members, my communication liaison actually, who worked with Lauren to get me here, lives in South Jersey where the flood events are actually happening. And she wrote this to me. She said, "So after driving home and pounding rainstorm for the 4th night this week, including Sunday from the shore, this is what I'm thinking. I'm afraid of the weather. It doesn't rain anymore. It pounds harder and longer. I drove on Route 295 home last night at 30 miles an hour with flashers on. I get so many flood and tornado alerts on my phone that my grandson that lives with me is terrified, including twice last night at 2 a.m. It's shrill and definitely wakes you up. A decade ago, I used to think I'd be dead before global warming really became a problem. Now I know it's here, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid of the weather." Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Fawn, Dave, Deborah, and Jane for sharing those stories. So I want to start, at the start of each of your programs, I don't think anyone anticipated how complex the implementation challenges would really be. And, that's really why we brought you here today to, tell the stories and solutions that you came up with through that process. As you were speaking, I jotted down a few themes. Just want to refresh that, and then I will sit down and join to start the panel discussion. There was a lot of talk of the level of trust in communities and dealing with the baggage of past planning or development changes. There was discussion of context of the housing market, particularly in New York City. There was a call for planning, whether it was pre or post-disaster, proactive or reactive. And there were also multiple funding sources that have been used to implement each of your programs. Before we get into the questions, I wanted to get a sense of who's in the audience. So get ready to raise your hand. Raise your hand if you are researching right now buyout programs. Great. Raise your hand if you are working in or on a buyout program and are looking to start one. Great. Raise your hand if you do neither of those but want to. And raise your hand if you haven't raised your hand yet. Okay, I'm going to call on a couple of you to tell me why you're here. Keep your hands up. Don't be shy. Ma'am. Great. Anyone else? Yes. Great. And we'll do 2 more before we get into questions. Yes, sir. Great. And a last person? Yes, ma'am. Great. Thank you. Wow. So we have such a diversity of professional interests here in the room. As to the arc of this panel discussion, I want to kind of start at the beginning, take us back to the moment that you first walked into, managing a buyout program, and then take us on an arc to thinking about the future. So. The first question I'd like to direct to both Jane and Deborah is to ask, in terms of being there right at the beginning of starting a post-disaster buyout program, what was the situation that you walked into? And feel free to talk about either your internal organization and the solutions that you came up with there, or in the communities and with the residents that you worked with.
I can start. I can tell, to be truthful, I started working in Sandy recovery in New York City. So I didn't join Gozer until February 2015, but we do have a lot of history in our buyout program and a lot of history where we worked with New York City together. So one of the first things, even prior to Gozer being created, was that other state agencies, in particular Department of State, had worked on identifying a risk analysis of the areas hit hardest by Sandy. And with that, once New York State received the federal funding, we took that information and worked with local officials to see if they were interested, as well as local homeowners to see if we could find areas where there would be great interest in one kind of buyout area rather than more scattered sites. So with that information, we developed the neighborhoods in Staten Island and Long Island to develop our buyout areas. Again, as I mentioned in my talk, one of our most successful areas was the Oakwood Beach area in Staten Island. And that was an area that was really vacation bungalows until right after World War II, when they were winterized for the soldiers coming home. And really, our homes built in a wetland shouldn't be there. And they had experienced repetitive flooding and were no stranger to the discussion of a buyout. And they talked to the governor and they talked to Gozer as soon as Gozer was created and the idea of recovery was talked about. And I think that's one of the key things in terms of success and what we should be doing, as areas are thinking about buyouts, in talking early and frequently to these areas so that you can get them comfortable and being proactive rather than reactive. And especially since it is so expensive, if you don't have federal money and are looking to state or local resources, you don't need to do it all at once also. If people are thinking of moving out, then the local municipality or the state can step in and start buying up the sites in these areas that are the highest risk, and then develop a full area as that happens over time.
I began working as an early part of New York City's housing recovery team. I am an urban planner by training, and I started working at New York City Housing Preservation and Development to work through the land use and zoning issues facing our housing in need of repair. I now joke that I sort of run New York City's affordable wetland development program, and it's kind of an odd fit at our housing preservation and development agency, but it's sort of an interesting part of sort of developing tools and resources for managing housing choice. Part of the work of the city has been to really look at housing opportunity and adaptation from a neighborhood-focused lens. We had an initiative, Resilient Edgemere, that really looked at the challenges and the choices inherent with making very significant recovery investments in housing that might not be viable in the long term, but also looking at, as we look at climate change and the science and data around climate adaptation with these very long time horizons, that as we're making choices about where we make investments, there are also like near and middle term opportunities to try and invest in stabilizing communities as we try and find long-term solutions for where people can and will live. And I would urge these groups, as we broadly look at the challenge of climate change, to not just be looking at the 2100 horizon, but really be thinking about 2030 and 2050 and what it means to change communities in these near terms.
So I think that statement about, the Affordable Housing Agency of New York City managing a wetlands program is pretty profound. And in a way, over the past 20 years, Fawn and Dave, you've really seen the evolution of these programs through from start to finish. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution? And also, can you speak to how your relationship, grappling with the baggage of government investment communities has evolved over time as you have worked better and better with the communities?
Well, as I mentioned, we started in '95, and honestly, we were really a conservation program, and so we didn't do flood buyouts. But what we started to see is that towns were applying for federal funding, and it was too difficult to get through the process. And so as a state, we felt we needed to offer some type of assistance. And so we realized there weren't a lot of hazard mitigation plans in place, so we were buying at 100%. And we worked with our state OEM. They got all the counties within New Jersey to have plans, and then we started to go into those worst hit communities. Immediately we saw that we'd come in with a buyout at the state level, and there were still people on the other side of the street or their neighbors that were still waiting for a buyout that went through the process 5 years ago, but the towns just couldn't get over the finish line. And so as more disasters happened, the state started to go into those worst hit communities and say, allow us to offer the assistance. At Sandy hit, we had already done it as just plain state acquisition. We had done federal funding applications. And so we were really the best fit to volunteer to allow the towns to focus on getting the kids back to school and getting the streets clean and the mud out of the basements and getting their communities working again, while we did the grant writing and pulled the funding in and went through the whole buyout. So in New Jersey, we do the grants, we do the outreach to the communities, the full real estate transaction. We oversee the demolition and the grading and seeding. The state actually owns the property, and we sign memorandums of understanding with the local governments to manage it as if it were their own. And then we work with our local universities to see what we can do to reestablish a way to incorporate those open space areas back into their communities. We've got flood absorption. The homes that are 1 street or 2 streets over then maybe don't flood as much. Housing prices go up. We've got a viable, healthy community again.
So, and I think like Fawn's programs, ours sort of evolved into flood buyout rather than started thinking about it from the start. So it was reactive, right? So we had put together a land acquisition program to protect the watershed writ large first, and a storm hit in 1996, and FEMA designated the storm, and local communities came to us and asked us to help them react to it. And then Irene and Lee, upstate, came, and again, we reacted to it. And in terms of evolution, we finally got in front of that, in a sense, if you will, right? Because FEMA's programs, once you designate a storm, are all about damage or prospective damage, right? 50% damage. And now, as you saw in that in those slides, where we've tried to put together a strategy where we're looking at 5 different categories and trying to address moving forward, thinking about the next storm, thinking about moving houses out of harm's way, whether or not they've been damaged, right? You saw erosion happening. That happens a little at a time, not necessarily after or at one storm, although that does happen as well. But you can sort of start to see erosion happening and then act to basically try to prevent that or address that property. And as mentioned, when we look at planning for stream stabilization, you're looking at maybe 3, 5, 10 landowners, and you won't get them all in a willing seller, willing buyer program. You won't get all 10 landowners lined up. You'll get 1 or 2 this year. You'll get maybe 1 in 3 years, and another a couple of years after that. So these things take time, and in fact, there are occasions where you can predict that you'll never get all the properties you need, at least not in our lifetimes. And so you have to start really thinking about how to work in the long-term time frame to make sure that there are incentives built in for those last landowners, and we're trying to figure that out as well. So those are some of the evolutionary steps that we've taken so far, and I think, Lauren, your other question was about how government has evolved or how the partnerships. And as I mentioned also, so we definitely started out and continue to be a local community-driven effort, in large part because of the baggage New York City carries upstate, right? The way we had condemned those areas to build the reservoirs and were not well loved up there to this day. And so under the FEMA programs, we had federal and state and county and town and New York City as partners. That's a pretty complex partnership. Under the city-funded program, it's pretty much just the city and the local community. So that's a lot easier to manage with a lot less moving parts. And so we think we've kind of simplified and found a way for a smarter, easier set of transaction and programs to happen. But we've also designed this program to effectively pause, if you will, at the next storm. So when FEMA steps in next time, we do want to use FEMA to fund new acquisitions at that point. And so we want to try to figure out a way to have the city's funded program continue to run, but in a step-back position. And we're not quite sure how that will work yet because we're just getting that program off the ground, but we're pretty confident that we'll have those two efforts aligned well soon.
Great, thank you. So you mentioned, even with a longer timeline, there are some homes you can see right away or some properties you can see right away that you'll never be able to sort of complete the parcel, right? And I think looking at it from a 1,000-foot view, you can look at vulnerability, look at the flood risk, and plan out an ideal solution. But the reality is that you really may never get there. And so I want to take a moment and really zoom in on these types of issues that prevent that perfect outcome. The way that I'd like to frame that is in terms of eligibility and general misconceptions about holdouts that you might have encountered in your work. So I feel like each of you could probably speak to this, so I'll take whoever wants to volunteer.
Well, I'll kick this off. I often encounter in communities people are like, well, you should just buy that person out. That's the only reasonable thing to do. And then you kind of encounter two kinds of property owners. Those who live directly on the waterfront, love the waterfront, wouldn't want to live any other place. And what makes their life great is where they are. And they're comfortable with that risk because that's the risk is part and very much intertwined with their quality of life. And that is one kind of holdout. Another kind of holdout is someone who is simply unable to sell. And someone can be unable to sell for a variety of reasons. Their causes could be outstanding debts on their property that significantly exceed any value that a public entity could pay. And they may have debts because we're still facing challenges from the foreclosure crisis from 2008 and changes in property values. But they also, New York City is extremely expensive, and they may be an owner who's consistently had to make choices between paying their electricity bill, paying their mortgage, paying their water bill, and have done what it takes to stay in their house, but done very little beyond that. I've had conversations with property sellers who I'm like, you have to pay your property taxes, and those debts make it impossible for them to sell their property and walk away with anything, or they're so underwater that they can't even sell. And for that owner, they're not holding out because they don't see the challenge in where they live, but they're holding out because there's no other place for them to go. And it's a real challenge if you're really having a discussion with someone with, oh, we'll purchase your property and then you're going to walk into our homeless shelter. And that's part of what I was trying to get to earlier, which is in terms of looking at trying to solve these solutions, we really have to look at where people can move and how to facilitate moving them and creating a housing choice for a place for them to go that can accommodate their house and their household size.
And so following up on that, how do post-disaster buyouts fit in with the overall ecosystem of housing counseling, housing services that support an affordable housing market or the private housing market?
Well, I'll stick with that. Like, New York City has really designed its programs with very significant counseling components and have worked really tirelessly with owners to encounter an array of counsel them through an array of challenges. And, debts and mortgages are kind of like the simplest. When you start getting into private judgments or, complex title issues that go at the heart of some of our historical housing choices, we have a significant number of owners who've inherited property that was winterized as part of it's sort of an effective slum clearance in the 60s and 50s and 60s under Robert Moses. Bungalows were winterized, so housing residents were pushed into them while their housing was cleared and turned into other affordable housing and quite a bit of what is our public housing now. And as those properties have been passed along, there's an array of title complexity that comes from those actions from 60 years ago.
Fawn, I'm wondering how New Jersey approaches the issue.
Yeah, we actually, Young Tao, my team, is my upside-down mortgage lead, and we recognized early that about 15% of our families were upside down on their mortgage. So we just created a team within our program to actually reach out to the banks and lenders to get debt forgiveness for these residents because they were in these flooded areas. So we see that as one alternative to offer assistance. We automatically, through the federal funding, help all tenants relocate. Just recently, in North Jersey, in Bergen County, which is just across the bridge in New Jersey, expensive area to live. We're finding that those residents are having a harder time relocating. So we're actually starting to take our tenant relocation team to do housing searches for them so that we can find them homes so we could actually complete the buyout and the demolition. So it's ever evolving. And so you look at the situation, whether it's a title issue, they're upside down on their mortgage or they can't find a place to go, and then you build that capacity to try to get them out. But it's just like David said, you go with the families that are ready, and then as soon as they see those homes gone, they realize the community's changing, they realize and believe that the government can actually do what they said, and then they say, is it too late? And then the next round comes in, and then the round after that. So just understanding, in many of the communities that we're in, we're there a second or third time as funding became available. We started with $100 million, we're up to $300 million as others couldn't spend. So it was just like, okay, we're ready. If we had that $300 million at the beginning, I think it'd be completely different. But the further out you get from the storm, depending on the rain or depending on the situation, families pull back. So the disasters, obviously, where all this rain kind of helps people remember that these are the options that are out there. But it's really the relocation of these families is what we see as the newest challenge on how we're going to have to expand our program if we want to be successful.
And I'll add just a nuance or a caveat, a different category of issues, which is commercial, right? You have residential and the commercial. I think commercial is in some ways much harder because you are dealing with a going concern that needs to buy a new property, start its business effectively before the old one is sold or closed down. And so that's a very heavy lift for most, mom and pop shops. So the commercial is almost sort of an animal unto itself that you need to create new programs for, and those are more, I think, generally going to be more expensive than residentials.
There are basically no tools for mixed-use buildings, so I think
Yes.
almost all yet. So almost all of us have excluded them.
And I think on that too, we've all kind of been focusing on single-family homes. I think any other sort of building stock is really difficult. Commercial, multi-use, manufactured homes, multifamily are all really difficult and really, I don't think, has found a successful way to carry out buyout programs yet, but can be carried off of how we've successfully done single-family buyout areas. And I just wanted to add too, I think, we've been looking at some of the decision-making processes of the individual homeowners, and it's all very different, which is why it's so important to continue to talk to these communities. We had homeowners who had repetitive loss, and you would think that they would want to stay in their community with their neighbors, school districts, close to their work. We've had homeowners with repetitive loss that moved states. And they just gave up. They wanted to move. We had some that stayed in their communities. So that decision-making process is really different. The biggest thing is being able to be financially secure enough to be able to move, but then what happens when you're relocating them? People are making decisions very differently. And that's interesting and good to know as we're thinking about the relocation piece of a buyout program.
So both of your programs, the Enhanced Buyout Program in Oakwood Beach and the city's program, offered incentives on top of that. What do you think is kind of the next step in evolving incentives or counseling or other assistance to help people relocate?
I think the incentives, the ability to offer incentives with our HUD funding was what made our program successful. If you compare it to FEMA programs, which are more ingrained and been carried out for much longer, communities are familiar with them, but they don't get as much money as they would have been able to do through our HUD-funded program. And by being able to offer that, by allowing the homeowners to be able to pay off their mortgage, to be able to have some assistance to relocate, that's really what allowed people to join our program. It's a lot of money, and I think that, again, the federal government and local municipalities need to be able to work together and think about it more proactively, and think about ways to be able to get incentives and get money to these homeowners, and recognizing that this protects greater communities. It's an investment to protect the communities that aren't bought out, that are a little further inland, and so it's a great investment. But I think that's really what was the success of our program, and incentives really need to be thought about when developing programs.
I agree with that. New York City rolled out its incentives program relatively late in our property acquisition programs, and it would have been more helpful. I think as we look at our toolkit of federal tools for property acquisition, they're really very focused on, not really having a beneficiary and just making a household whole. And that actually creates a lot of challenges and can inhibit choice. Because if someone's a homeowner and they actually want to go into a rental situation, there's not an incentive for that. And the tools we have are pretty complex and pretty limiting for that circumstance. And I think having, although it's extremely high cost, the most flexible ability to deploy resources to encourage people to move would be most helpful versus micromanaging people's choices.
So we haven't added true incentives to the program yet, in part because we think the programs themselves are incentives. In other words, there's no other buyer out there for a lot of these homes. They're damaged, or they're in harm's way, or flood insurance will cost 17 times what it did 5 years ago. So we see the program right now as running with a lot of interest without incentives, and we're concerned about adding incentives being perceived as unfair to prior sellers. So right now, that's kind of where we've stood. So it sounds a little different than some of the other programs.
And did you want to answer?
No, I just wanted to add, New York City's disaster recovery landscape is pretty unique in that property values have really gone up almost everywhere. So participants in our program later along the line really had other choices, and if they really wanted to sell, could sell for more on the open market, which is another reason we have low participation.
So sorry, Fawn, to cut you off, but I want to make sure we get to disposition as well. So I think what we're seeing here, is that incentives are things that are being tried, but we don't really have a clear, consistent path forward yet. But to turn the conversation over to those in the room who think more about open space and the end uses of these properties, there were also challenges in solutions created for the ultimate end use. And Fawn, I'm wondering whether you could speak to that as someone who sits in DEP and works very closely with the open space side of it.
Well, we work with our locals inland and if they see the way they deem they want these properties to be used for their communities, we vet them, and then we work with the local universities that are assisting them.
So what are some of those conversations like?
Native species, no, you can't put in ornamentals, it can't be paved, it has to be porous. If you want garden beds, it has to be raised garden beds. So it's just what the immediate community is looking at. In our Delaware Bayshore area, our fish and wildlife managers are actually managing those areas. And so we're working with Stockton University in South Jersey, and we're doing bathymetric surveys, and we're looking at actually dredging one of our local channels down there for our shell fisheries folks, and taking the sand from there and building up dunes on our area for the horseshoe crabs and the piping plover. So every area is different based on the ecological value of that area. In the south, it's basically wet and coastal, and the other areas we're looking at saturated suburban areas. So we're doing paths with wetland forest plantations and planning and those kind of things.
Jane, I'm wondering whether you could speak to the connection between coastal protection and the buyouts.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's a long-term conversation, and what we're grappling with at Gozer, given that we essentially go away in September 2022. We're completely funded by our federal grant, and that's when the money runs out. So we recognize the importance of coastal protection, and that these programs and the return to nature and wetlands will protect the inland communities. How that looks and how that is mapped and who's going to maintain it, there's work to be done and data to be collected that we may not be around for, but we want to make sure that that information is kept and is being developed. So when we are working with our other partners and organizations and trying to figure out who will be the long-term steward of these sites, that will be part of it. Because right now, we're just, we started in 2013, we're just finishing up all the demolitions. The native flora and fauna are just starting to come back. So we're just starting to see that the protection and what the impact can be. But then what does that look like in 5 years? Gozer won't be here, but someone should really be looking at this. These areas in the buyout program started with a risk assessment. Then we should continue to research and see what the result is of these bio areas, and then how we can apply it to other areas too. I think that would be really effective in how the state looks at where we pick the bio areas.
Yeah. So the last question that I want to ask the panelists before we open it to the audience is, how should we be thinking about recovery versus long-term adaptation, given different funding sources, given different timelines?
I'll keep saying it. We should be proactive. Yeah. I say this is the theme in my job, in my life. I think the federal government needs to be proactive. I think state and local municipalities need to be proactive. What happens after a big disaster is that people are so distraught. They're not living in their homes. They can't make these decisions. They just want to get back into a stable housing environment. If we've already been having these conversations, or we've already been doing this work to make the communities more resilient, the recovery effort won't be as extreme as we've seen after Sandy, and after we've seen in the 2016 and 17 storms in the South also. And I think that's what we just need to be proactive, and we need to encourage the federal government to provide funding that allows for state and local municipalities to be proactive also.
I think we need to talk to the federal government about getting money to us sooner. What we see happen all the time is a disaster comes, they're evaluating the damage so they can figure out how much money they give to the states. By that time, they've already received insurance, they've already pulled the drywall out, and they've already started to do what every family needs to do, which is get their house in order so that their family can get back to their everyday life. And so we're looking at all the money that's going out up front, and then we're going through our grant process, and then we're taking another pot of tax dollars to go back to that same house and then buy it and knock it down. And when I do an appraisal, I say to the families, if there's something in here you want to keep, I need to tell the appraisers before we do the valuation, because what we're buying is the entire home. And so you can't take everything out. It would make sense that they could take everything out and move it into a new home, but the value of that entire structure, inside and out, is what we're trying to give them the most money possible to move on with their lives. So what's happening is our demo companies are actually taking the salvage value of a lot of the new stuff that just got put in that home. And hopefully, you know, it's going, they're making money off of it. It's bringing our demo costs down, maybe a little, maybe not. But some of it goes to Habitat for Humanity and others, but others, they're just marketing all those brand new, you know, stoves and refrigerators and things to other people. So we've got to find a way to stop giving, you know, duplicative funds to the same structure every storm. And I think that if we could find a way to just get the money out quicker so that we could get those folks out, put them in a hotel, give them the money for their home, let them find a new home. I think that's got to be part of the solution.
And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Yes. Go ahead.
Following up on the proactive question, I'm curious if any of you, in terms of getting money sooner, getting people thinking about this so that when a disaster or a major event arrives, this is not reacting to an acute event, but being prepared and knowing your options. Have any of you considered some of the newer technologies being discussed? Like Craig Fugate, former director of UNH, is now working like a startup looking at AI and different technologies to start looking at the built environment and, you know, the uncertainty in flood risk models and saying, are there certain ways that you can run all these different models to see what areas are most vulnerable, what areas might make sense to move or to relocate to, and if any of those tools might be helpful in just getting a better idea of what makes sense and then being able to have better incentives and then being able to apply for money with just a clearer picture. If those sort of tools are on anyone's radar.
I'll jump in just to say that when I talked about local flood assessments, that's New York City funding studies that are basically managed at the local level to look at where you get the biggest bang for the buck and where you see the most dangers in terms of future flooding and the effects of lowering elevations when you do certain things. So we are definitely implementing those tools at a very complex GIS level, looking at you know, all the hydrography and flood models and all of that to do a number of things. One is to make sure that locals understand what the threats are and what the risks are, so that they don't do any more construction in, you know, bad places, and that they start to appreciate the importance of, you know, both planning and trying to reduce all of the improvements in those areas so that we can have a plan and implement the plan before the next flood even comes. But it's a big watershed. We'll be successful in some places and other places not so much. And there'll be buy-in to a great extent in some towns and others not so much.
In New Jersey, we're working on plans. So our last administration, climate change, sea level rise, we weren't even allowed to say the words, and so now we are. So we're in catch-up mode, and we're working on coastal resilient plans and sea level rise plans, and they are supposed to give the guidance. But in New Jersey, it's home rule. You know, we have 566 kingdoms, and so looking at that with municipal land use law, you know, I've gone into plenty of towns where I've been doing buyouts on one end, and they're developing on the other end. So internally, we've got to make some of the hard decisions on, once those guidance docs come out, to be able to say that, you know, we have the science, we've got the models, and we need to start saying beyond this line, no more. And once something happens to that affected area, then the only alternative is that we're going to do buyouts, or at this level we're going to do the elevations. You know, maybe on this end we're going to do beach replenishment, but they are all costs. I mean, the fact that I mentioned earlier, we have a stable source of funding that's coming in for Blue Acres. That's going to allow us to leverage and apply for every federal fund that's out there to match those dollars. But we've gone into communities where the federal money didn't work, and then we can pull that state money in. So we're looking. I think that there's a lot of fresh, new information that's coming in, and as our guides come into place, we can start to hopefully incorporate some of the things like Fugate and others, and hopefully be able to convince some of these towns that because of the future is around the corner, we need to really start looking at how we can implement and save their communities. Otherwise, their money's just going to run and run and run. They're not going to be able to get their municipal finance backing that they need to get their bonds so that they can run their communities time in, time out. Their assessed values are going to go up. The flood insurance is going up. I mean, so it's a vicious cycle that's already kind of starting to spin out of control. And so I think a lot of the science and the planning and the guides, hopefully, will allow us to get across the kitchen table with the families and the advocates in the communities, as well as the governing bodies of these towns, to say there's a healthy way to do this and still sustain, an economic community.
In the back.
So at either the state level, New York State, New Jersey, or the city of New York, when you talk about the opportunity to get money more quickly to communities, is there discussion or consideration about things like parametric insurance or catastrophic bonds in order to do that?
And we have it, so we are focused on the Sandy Recovery Buyout Program right now, and I think with the success of it, the state is looking at other ways to implement buyout areas. With Sandy, we were mostly focused in Staten Island and Long Island. In upstate New York, especially in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of riverine flooding in communities, which are also not as big as the buyout areas that we implemented after Sandy, but could make a really useful impact. So those are some of the conversations we're having now based off of the success that we had after Sandy.
Yes, ma'am.
Not yet.
I mean, I think it's sort of looking at this challenge differently. Like New York has been looking at adaptation of its multifamily housing stock and looking at our affordable housing programs and our sources of income there in terms of trying to just like reduce development, like reduce habitation in like ground floors and basements. And it's pretty complex looking at our regulatory environment and trying to find ways to use our tools to reasonably reduce habitation in dangerous places.
Great. The woman in the gray jacket.
I have a question about, it seems like a lot of what we're talking about is money for the most part going one way. So it makes me wonder if there's been any exploration, given the loss of property tax revenues that come with some of these programs, to try to monetize nature-based solutions in order to create new revenue streams to help municipalities recover that loss of that tax revenue, either through wetlands banking. I know that wetlands mitigation bank in Houston is maxed out, for example, on its credits. So I'm just wondering whether fisheries improvements, wetlands banking, any other things, there's been an effort to revalue the water or the land that's facing the water, the wetlands facing the water, in order to compensate for the loss of tax revenues during buyouts.
And that's also one of the things, Sandy hit New York hard, and we weren't prepared in terms of doing large-scale disaster recovery efforts in the state. And so when we developed Gozer and started thinking about these ideas, especially as we're starting to think about the disposition of land, a wetland bank, a land bank would be incredibly useful for these types of things. Again, Gozer is temporary. So we're having these conversations now and what that looks like. And that is one of the challenges, the loss of tax revenue in doing a buyout program. We did, one of our incentives for our buyouts was if the homeowner remained within the community to help alleviate some of that. But it is a very interesting thing and thing that should be thought about, kind of revaluing the water and wetlands. And it would help in both ways, both for the municipality, but also handling what that disposition and the maintenance and ownership would look like also.
I would just add this is one more reason to lobby your elected officials. Like the community development block grants for disaster recovery are very short-term tools. They don't really allow you to land bank. So the amount of property you would need to do a wetlands mitigation bank, it would take like quite a bit of time for that to become profitable, and in the interim you'd be holding unimproved things that want to be wetlands. Similarly with property that might make sense for redevelopment, even if it's a redevelopment in a pattern that's kind of different than what was there before, the community development block grants for disaster recovery don't allow you to allow long-term transitions. You have to kind of make a choice with that property and have that property go into the state within a really near term. So looking at the 5 to 10 year time frame rather than the 20-year time frame, and that's pretty choice limiting.
In New Jersey, we had a unlimited of tax program that was stopped by the last administration, and we are trying to get that reinstated. For every piece of property that's preserved in a town, the town gets money, a check basically from the state to offset the loss of that rateable. And so if we could do that in some of these buyout towns, that would immediately offer assistance. But I do want to mention that, you know, there are folks now that are out there looking at the cost of constantly having to fund disaster recovery in the community. So you may think that there's a loss of a rateable, but ultimately if you could remove where, you know, maybe, you know, a large portion of a local government's funding is going to constantly take care of that one area of the community, if you could alleviate that burden, then you're going to see the value of the rest of the community go up. And in one of our townships, that has already started to happen. We're in our third round of buyouts there in Woodbridge Township, Middlesex County. Jen Swartz is here from Scientific American. She actually did a article back in August on the township. But they have already seen their property values back. And so I think when you take the time to recognize where all of your local dollars are going, it may look like it's a loss of rateable, but you're pouring tons of emergency service dollars into those areas. So some places wetland mitigation banks may work, but I think that going after the homes that are repetitively flooded and getting them out of harm's way is actually going to provide benefit back to the community, and it doesn't take that long.
Yeah, I would, for New York City's watershed, I would echo what Fawn just described, and say that New York City does pay full property taxes as assessed in the watershed, which means when the house is removed, it's vacant land. But we also have strong encouragements for local communities to implement, you know, ecotourism and recreational uses. We open almost all of our properties for public access, and you know, the passive uses that go along with watershed protection, hunting, hiking, fishing. So we are trying to help communities focus on the ecosystem-sensitive uses of our lands.
Thank you. So I think we're out of time, and I want to just take a moment to thank the panelists for their expertise. We've covered a lot of ground today, from issues of housing and relocation to the creation and even monetization of new open space. There's a lot of ground to cover in terms of post-disaster buyouts, different timescales as well as we move into long-term adaptation planning. Feel free to come up and talk to the panelists after, and we'll all be here. Thanks again for coming to post-disaster buyouts.